Good morning, and thank you for joining us at Kingdom Voices. This is our special edition because today we're going to be talking about modern day slavery. So you need to get your friends, your family, and please do repost this edition. It is a special edition of Kingdom Voices because this topic is very unique. We've never had anybody speaking on this topic. It's very important. We need to know some facts about modern day slavery. So on this platform, we talk to pace setters, we talk to history makers, we talk to territory takers. And that is Luke 2:49 that says, I must be about my Father's business. So the men and women on this program are doing just that. They're trailblazing, they're pace setting, and they're taking territory from the enemy for the kingdom of God. So I want to go ahead and introduce you to my guest, and her name is Dr. Sandie Morgan. Dr. Sandie, thank you
Thank
for
you.
joining us.
Thank you.
Well, she is a expert in this topic that we're going to talk about, modern day slavery. So I would like to go ahead and read some of her bio just to let you know how much she's been working on this and how long she's been doing this. She's a director of the Global Center for Women and Justice at the Vanguard University. She is an educator. She is a nurse. She's recognized globally for her expertise in combating human trafficking and working to end violence against women and children. Dr. Morgan is experienced serving exploited women, men, and children and includes direct care as a pediatric nurse. She is a volunteer with the Doctors of the World, and that includes in Athens and in Greece, and as a past administrator of the Orange County Human Trafficking Task Force. Dr. Morgan recently served as a co-chair of the Public-Private Partnership Advisory Council to end human trafficking by the presidential appointment. So she has had a presidential appointment. She hosts the End Human Trafficking podcast with listeners in 148 countries and is a co-author of Ending Human Trafficking, a handbook of strategy for the church today. Now we have her book right there on screen. So please do order that book. Dr. Sandie, where can they order that book?
You can order it on InterVarsity Press and use the code EHT30 to get 30% off, or you can order it from wherever you order online books, or go to your Christian bookstore and ask them to have it on the shelf.
All righty. So that's just a little bit about her. Like I said, she carries a big mandate. She has a big calling as far as the human trafficking is concerned. So right now, I want to go ahead and refer the viewers to you in that tell them, how did this calling come about in your life?
I think I've always been very tuned in to who's the underdog in this situation. And I remember as a little girl being at a Little League baseball game and people asked me, who are you rooting for? And my dad would always say, we're rooting for whoever needs the most rooting for them.
Wow.
And that really affected how I see the world. Actual human trafficking comes into two different areas: sex trafficking and labor trafficking. And many times people don't realize that labor trafficking happens right in their neighborhood. And so when I was a nurse working night shift, I admitted a 14-year-old boy who was being sold by family members with substance use issues. And that was really my first introduction to the sex trafficking side of human trafficking, modern day slavery. And I began to read my Bible. My husband and I later lived in Athens, Greece, where I became very active in the community to get legislation passed and the anti-human trafficking laws that started here for me in the US in 2000 later were passed in 2004 in Greece. And when I came back to the States, ended up working at Vanguard University as a professor. And I have to tell you, I love teaching. So if you ask me a question, I'm going to give you the whole answer.
Good.
And you'll have to hit pause. And maybe I'll send out a test, a quiz at the end of the show to make sure you all pass and have the knowledge.
That is a real teacher, right?
Yes.
You know, I love the fact that your dad gave you a framework about tuning into the less fortunate, tuning into the underdog, and those that are forgotten. You know, maybe the lowest on the totem pole. So that kind of directed your heart immediately. Is that right?
Yes.
You know, and I love this scripture that says, Jeremiah 22, it says, do justice and righteousness. Deliver the one who has been robbed for their power over from an oppressor. So God is for the oppressed. Right?
Yes, yes. And a similar verse in Proverbs 31 just it's on my wall, in my office, in my home. It says in Proverbs 31:8, be a voice for those who have no voice.
Yes.
And then there's a semicolon. So the mandate isn't over. We can't just talk about it. We actually have to figure out what to do because it says ensure justice. And it's the same word for righteousness. Ensure justice for those being crushed. And that's what we want. We don't want to wait till someone is a slave and then try to find a way to rescue them. We want to do prevention, to intervene. And when someone has been oppressed and lost their power, I love that verse in Jeremiah, then we want to restore them to their full capacity as a human being created in the image of God.
So did you grow up in a Christian home?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
I memorized my Bible verses, which is good because now I need larger print. And
Yes. Okay. So your heart was immediately toward those that have fallen through the cracks.
Yes, the most marginalized. I think one of the reasons that I love the Gospels is we keep seeing Jesus on the sidelines and his disciples say, Lord, Lord, come back over here. And he's like, no, I'm going to talk to the woman at the well. I'm going to talk to the woman with a issue of blood. I'm going to talk to the woman who lost her son.
That's right.
And more of us need to look for who's on the sideline that we could minister to.
That is definitely God's heart. He says he looks to the weak. He looks to those that have been broken, and he favors them. He favors the crushed. He favors those that nobody else favors. He favors the overlooked. And I love that about my father because many times, I don't know about you, but I felt overlooked and crushed. So when did you receive your call to do something, to do this?
Well, I think there have been several markers along my journey, and I love the image in the Old Testament when God's people suddenly understood something new and they built an altar of rocks in the river to remind them of that day. And I have those moments, but I do believe that we are all called and mandated in this verse, ensure justice for those being crushed. And so I'm especially committed to the education component. That's why I wrote the book,
That's
because
right.
I want the church to be educated, to have knowledge. In Philippians chapter 1, verse 9, it says that if we want to see love abound, and I have to tell you, everywhere I go, I preach at church, I teach at a Christian university, someone comes and says, Dr. Morgan, I am so passionate and I just want to love on these victims. And of course, I've got decades of experience, and I know it's a very long healing journey, and there is a lot of work to do in prevention and in our criminal justice system to prosecute the perpetrators. But ultimately, Philippians 1:9 tells us that if we want that love to abound, the formula is knowledge and insight that produces discernment. Discernment is a component of wisdom, so that when we see what we see, we understand what it is and we know how to respond.
That's powerful. Can you tell us a little bit more about the human trafficking and what has been going on with it? Because really, I think a lot of us are not aware.
Well, I'm excited that today we're preparing for World Day Against Trafficking in Persons. What would it look like if believers around the world came together and prayed on July 30th, World Day Against Trafficking in Persons, World Day against the oppression and the crushing of people created in God's image just like us? And that idea around trafficking in persons from a legal framework is whenever someone is recruited, obtained, sometimes moved, but doesn't have to be into another country, through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. Somebody offered them a job that didn't really exist, and then when they got there, locked them in a factory to work, or threatened that they would harm them or a family member. So force, fraud, or coercion. And then for the purpose of slave labor, labor in factories, in fields, in plantations, in cocoa plantations, all kinds of labor, even domestic servitude in homes in Southern California, and or sex trafficking, when someone is selling another person to make a profit. Commercial sexual exploitation is the more formal term, and it just means somebody's doing this for a business. And the root of human trafficking, modern day slavery, is greed. We don't want to pay our workers, we want to make more money. And even the sex trafficking is about making more money. It's about greed.
And I'm sure that some of you are surprised by that. We might think that people are doing such things because of other reasons, but that shocked me when you just said that greed. But it sure does make sense. It
I
sure does.
I often have been asked to talk about this in churches, and when I do, I I want people to understand that we do need the knowledge and the insight so we understand what we're seeing, so we don't actually do more harm than good, because sometimes we have really good intentions, but we haven't studied the issue to understand how to go about it, which is why my friends and I wrote this book as a strategy guide for church leaders. I think one of the things that we can start looking at in a conversation at a global level, but also at a local level, is for us to understand what's happening in our own community. And I have to tell you, I used to work near this TV station, and we recovered really women, and found ways to help them within a mile from right here.
Really?
And I think people think it's
shocking.
happening over there
Yeah,
someplace,
right.
not right
Exactly.
here. But Orange County is where I live. And so, because I practice what I preach, knowledge and insight, I find out how many victims have been recovered right here in my own county. And then how can I be part of helping, of serving? And then how can I be part of preventing it from ever happening?
Yeah,
And
and that
those are
takes education.
questions we have to ask.
Well, that's why we're so glad you're here. What are some of the is there a profile of a victim?
Oh, okay. So in my presentation to churches, I often talk about the perfect storm.
Okay.
And we start with greed and waves of greed. People want more and more. And we talk about retail therapy. We just want more. So how do we overcome greed? And then the victim is vulnerable. And the United Nations, that hosts the World Day Against Trafficking in Person, tells us that the most marginalized, because of poverty, they don't even know where their next meal is coming from. They may be in a place where women and girls are seen as less valuable than men and boys, or they may not even have school for the girls. So those kinds of vulnerabilities are the second component of a perfect storm. And the third component is demand. And we think about that when we talk about sex trafficking as people looking to purchase a person for a commercial sex act, or people on the internet buying pornography and driving more and more demand for that. And that is a very real part of modern day slavery. But there's three times as much labor trafficking. And I tell
There's
you,
3 times as much more than sex trafficking.
yes.
Really?
I know,
Okay,
you're
yes.
shocked.
Yeah,
And here's
yes.
what it looks like.
Uh-huh.
I'm driving demand for labor trafficking. I am learning how to check the supply chain for products that I buy.
Okay.
And I'm learning, for instance, I started studying, where does chocolate come from? I like dark chocolate. I found out that on the west coast of Africa, there were 250,000 children, slaves on cocoa plantations. So I could buy cheap chocolate? No, so now I won't buy chocolate unless I know it's from a privately sourced, the supply chain has been checked,
My goodness.
or it's been certified fair trade. And I have to pay more. I have to pay $2 or $3 for a chocolate bar instead of 50 or 75 cents. But there's a component of stewardship in that. I think when I was growing up, I thought stewardship was having a good budget and not spending too much money.
Sure.
But stewardship in Genesis is about dominion over the whole earth.
Right.
And so if I'm spending 75 cents for a chocolate bar, knowing that a child on another continent isn't getting an education and is working with a machete every day harvesting the cocoa beans, that's not good stewardship. It's better stewardship for me to spend more knowing that adults are getting paid a fair wage,
Right.
and then they can send their children to school. And honestly, I think I don't need to eat as much chocolate, and it might be better stewardship for me too, health-wise.
Well, you just opened up our minds right there, because most of us have not thought that way. So thank you for that.
And it's
Thank you for that.
everything. It's our clothes, our technology. There's an app. It's free. It's called slaveryfootprint.org. And it's a great exercise for a family event in the evening to figure out all the things that your family has. And then it computes through statistics I don't understand, but it'll tell you how many slaves work for you. And we all, like the mineral for my phone, coltan mostly comes from the Congo. And in the Congo, children are used in the mines because they want them to get into small places.
Okay.
And that can be in my phone. Well, at first, I
Goodness.
wanted to throw my phone away when I learned that. But then how would you reach me?
Right.
And so it's so complicated.
Yes.
And we've recently, in California in 2010, we passed the Supply Chain Transparency Act. So you can ask a big company, where does my chocolate come from? Where do the minerals come from? And now we're working to reduce that slavery in those places. And that in turn works to build stronger communities, more resilient communities.
My goodness. Now, I know that I think it was Cambodia, but it could be anywhere. If a woman has a daughter, and they're, of course, in poverty, she's going to allow that daughter to be taken from her and put in a sex trade.
That happens sometimes.
Okay.
It's not all the time.
Okay.
And it's more frequently the families that are more marginalized because they are indigenous people, they're rural people, and they don't have the same access to resources. But there's a lot of misconceptions about the risk, and it does happen to little girls, but it also happens to little boys. Remember, in the hospital that night, my first victim was a 14-year-old boy.
And that was here in the United States.
Here in California.
Okay.
Here in California.
Wow.
And we aren't even looking for boys most of the time. And when we look at, you asked me about the profile of a victim, when we're talking about children being commercially, sexually exploited, usually here in Orange County, more than 90% of the children that we've served already had a history in child welfare. They already were in a marginalized place, maybe a family member with substance use disorder, maybe domestic violence, and they're running away because of the fighting at home. Or maybe they're being abused by a family member, either physically or sexually, or by neglect. I don't think most people understand that neglect is one of the most common forms of child abuse, and it makes a child more vulnerable. So in that perfect storm, greed, somebody wants to make money, they want to get things, more stuff, vulnerability, the people that are the most marginalized, and then the third thing, demand. And we can help reduce demand. We can do that.
Okay. And how can we do that?
Well, we can start asking questions. I think asking questions is a gift. And I love it when I read in Genesis God asked Adam questions.
Mm.
When we study the Gospels, Jesus asked people questions. So I'm not here to point at you and tell you what's wrong with you. I want you to ask questions. So one of the apps that I have that helps me teach people around me, and especially children, so they begin to develop empathy for children on other continents, it's called Sweat and Toil. And I downloaded it on my phone. And when I'm at the grocery store and I'm going to buy blueberries, and it's January, and there aren't any blueberries in season in California in January, and they have a little sticker that says they're from Argentina. And I look that up on my app, and it says children are being used to harvest those blueberries. So you know what I do? I put the blueberries back, and I buy apples from Temecula.
Okay.
So I
That's,
start making choices.
yes,
They're little
yes.
choices, but more and more corporations are making choices. Corporations are being asked to make choices in how they purchase their supplies. There's a church in Australia that made a policy, and I use that in this book of Handbook of Strategies, made a policy that anything the church buys, the procurement person has to check the supply chain. If they're buying paper, they need to know where it came from. If they're buying coffee, is everybody involved in that getting paid a fair wage?
Right.
So that I'm not for blame for promoting more demand because I'm
My
greedy
goodness,
and
yes.
want to keep more for myself.
Goodness. That is some good information in there then. Can you tell us more about that book?
Yes, actually, the foreword for the book was
Okay.
written by former Ambassador John Cotton Richmond. And he actually says in the foreword, churches have a unique and special role to play. But he gives this caveat: if properly trained and equipped, followers of Jesus stand poised to make a huge impact. So in this book, we have 8 chapters. We talk about the history. We talk about prevention and protection. And at the end of each chapter, there's an opportunity for church leaders to engage. If you imagine that those vulnerable people are on the edge of a steep and deadly cliff, you could be like some people who have an ambulance or even a hospital built at the bottom of the cliff.
Right.
Or you can start building a fence so they don't fall. And I don't want you to build the fence by yourself. I want you to start the fence here and the church down the street to add some pieces to that, because
That's
the
good.
fence here
Yes.
is different than the fence in Congo
Okay.
or on the west coast of Africa or in Cambodia or in Northern California. And the book actually has strategies for how you build a fence in your own community.
How is that book being received in churches?
Oh my goodness, I got an email last week, and the entire leadership is reading the book over summer.
Let me put it
And
on this
once a
side so you
week,
can see it, because that
oh,
blocks it.
sorry.
No worries.
Once a week, the leadership team talks about a chapter for 8 weeks. They've already avoided some decisions that they didn't have enough knowledge and insight. And they
Awesome.
said, it saved us thousands of dollars
Wow.
that we can then invest in a more effective fence. We're not going to buy an ambulance now. We're building a fence.
Oh, that's what we want,
That's
prevention.
exact. It
Yeah.
also teaches you the language to be salt and light in your community, to show up at your local task force and work with law enforcement and be partners, because you have a unique opportunity, like the ambassador said, and you just need to learn the language. You know, my husband and I were missionaries, and when we went overseas, we had to learn the language. We did not expect them to learn our language so we could teach them
Right.
the Bible.
Right. Right.
Yeah, no, that's upside down.
Sure
So
is.
when church leaders say, well, they didn't do this for me, and I wanted to do this, and they said, no, you didn't learn the language. You didn't know they have legal obligations that they can't do some of the things you want them to do. And then we treat them poorly. We need to be much more knowledgeable so that we can be good partners. And I think one of the things that I love about growing up in the church, I grew up learning the Bible stories. And if you don't read the Old Testament, I meet people who've never read the Old Testament.
Christian
Joseph,
people.
yes,
Right.
Joseph was a slave. Oh my goodness, I've done podcasts about Joseph and what he teaches us about familial trafficking, family members that traffic their own, just like Joseph. I meet people who don't understand that debt is still a reason that people are trafficked. And in 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 1 through 7, the widow comes to the prophet Elisha and says, my debtors are coming to take my 2 sons as slaves. Now that's an old story, and he has a solution, but that happens every single day globally. Debtors come and the traffickers come to take someone as a slave to pay a debt. It happened right here in Orange County. And so what does the prophet do? He doesn't bring her, the mom to a TV station and the boys and do a video and take an offering. He asks her, what do you have? Asset-based community development. It's like he had a PhD. He started right where she is, and she said, I have a little flask of olive oil. Now that was just enough for her lamp to get home at night. That's like you having a AA battery for your flashlight. Wasn't even enough to cook a full meal. So he told her, and this is another part of community engagement, you want to be out in your community. He sent them to borrow empty vessels from everybody, family, friends, neighbors, and the boys bring them in, and then he says, shut the door, and she starts pouring from that little flask until every jar is full. And now she's an olive oil entrepreneur. The one practice, being a businesswoman for a widow in that era. And now she doesn't come back next month to take another offering. She is fully able to support and sustain her family. We can learn from the Old Testament those stories.
That is amazing. Because there's so much, well, the Bible is the Bible of truth, right? It is truth, and we learned that. But you've got here in chapter 4, protection, and then you write identity.
Yes.
So talk about that a little bit.
There's 5 P's in the globally recognized model that I work with law enforcement, United Nations, embassies, and they start with prevention. How do we do prevention? Protection is when we recover a victim. How do we keep them safe as they're on their healing journey? And so that protection phase starts with identifying a victim. And I'm really concerned that we don't see the victims.
No, we don't.
They're invisible.
They're hidden right in front of us, though.
Exactly.
Yeah, they're hidden.
And one of the reasons there's much more emphasis on sex trafficking in many places is because it's against the law to sell sex. So when you see that happening, you pick up the phone and you call 888-3737, 888, the National Human Trafficking Hotline.
Can you say that again? I don't know that we know that.
888-3737, 888. But it's not against the law to wash dishes 16 hours a day, 7 days a week in a restaurant where they have an all-you-can-eat buffet for $8 and nobody's getting paid and nobody sees that person who has no way out. You don't see the domestic servant who's sleeping in the garage. You don't see people. So learning how to identify, that's what we can do because we know our communities. If you come to my community, you might not see things, but I know what was normal in my community. You know what's normal, and you don't have to understand everything. You just need to know how to ask questions, and your question, your phone call could save somebody's life.
You know that I've seen this in airports. If you see it, say it. You know, so we want to uncover things that need to be uncovered. So that requires knowledge and care and concern on our part. We need to be concerned.
Exactly.
And as Christians, we definitely should be concerned. That's part, like she said earlier, that's part of our calling. So identify, yes, what are some of the red flags?
When someone isn't able to speak for themselves and they don't have control of their own documents, that's often a sign of a foreign national victim. They never have a day off. One case not far from, one case not far from here was in an elder residential care facility, and it was in a residential neighborhood, and the neighbor jokingly said to the girl, well, you never get a day off. And she had been told that if you tell anybody, they're going to take you to jail and you'll never see your family again. So she dropped the hose. She was watering the flower bed and ran inside. And the neighbor thought, that's strange.
Right.
So he called and he said, I don't think these kids that are working there get a day off. And it started an investigation. And 6 young people who had been trafficked from the Philippines and were working in various residential homes were rescued, recovered.
Wow.
And we're trying to get away from using the word rescue because just getting them out isn't enough. Then you have to have support services and restitution and help them get a job and regaining human dignity.
My goodness, we need to all be aware. Now, how many of those that break the law like this, how many come to justice?
Oh my goodness, you are singing Ambassador Richmond's favorite song, Not Enough. Not enough. And in fact, in the last 3 years, globally, prosecutions of the perpetrators have dropped 45%. So one of the things that I believe is that in our churches, there are gifted, talented people who are teachers in schools that can be part of prevention with children. There are nurses and social workers and case managers who can be part of the restoration. But there are also law enforcement officers, investigators, attorneys, and judges who can be drivers in bringing the perpetrators to justice.
And we need that. I know there are a lot of retired lawyers. There's retired
we need people who are already working in that space.
Yes, working. Probably because I'm in that retirement age.
Oh,
I thought about that.
But, yeah, we can do that.
You know, there's some perpetrators that tell the victim, well, you owe me. That little phrase, you owe me. And so they're threatened. They're threatened if they uncover, if they say anything, that their families will be hurt. Now, how many of those perpetrators really follow through with the violence that says, I'm going to hurt your family if you don't follow through with the promise, because after all, you owe me?
That's a very broad question from a lot of different perspectives.
Okay.
It is a very violent crime, and this is, as the director of Vanguard University's Global Center for Women and Justice, working to end violence against women and children. This is how human trafficking became such a major platform for us. The traffickers use violence to control, and the threats, the coercion, are part of the legal definition so that we can put the perpetrators behind bars and make them pay restitution to their victims.
Wow.
They do keep their promises, their threats, and I don't want to get really into a lot of horrific detail, but there have been many, many instances where a family member suffered, and many instances where someone was harmed right in front of other victims so that they would all learn their lesson. In cases here in Orange County, the perpetrators held the person's passport and had a gun sitting on top of it as a visual reminder to everyone of the violence they could use to control people.
Oh my. Okay.
So the threat is real, and we don't ever want someone to think that it's like a TV show.
You know, nowadays I know that I've learned to pray, because I have little ones, grandchildren. So I've learned to pray in Jesus' name. I declare and decree there'll be no murders, there'll be no rapes, there'll be no kidnappings, things that we need to declare and decree in prayer. So I'm really understanding that our prayers have power, and we need to exercise the authority that God gives us as mothers and as grandmothers, because we can rest in declaring and decreeing a thing. So we need to
Amen.
learn how to pray. So do you want to?
I've got a prayer I want to read to you.
Yes, please do.
The handbook has 8 chapters, and we use the 5P model that's used in the marketplace, in government, and so on. But then we add a 6th P of prayer.
Okay.
And in the foreword, Ambassador Richmond, who was a former Department of Justice prosecutor, interviewed so many victims of human trafficking as he prosecuted their traffickers. And in one case, this is what he said. A survivor of human trafficking once told me that the only thing her trafficker could not control was her ability to pray. She prayed to God for her pain to end. She prayed that people would do more than be informed and more than merely have distant compassion. She prayed that people would take smart, strategic action that would restore her freedom and allow her to thrive beyond her trauma. Wow. God answered her prayers by using his people in many different professions to bring hope. And this book, I believe, is an answer to her prayer.
That was powerful. We can also pray, Father, hide my loved ones from those that want to do evil towards them. God hides his people. When he wants you hidden, he'll hide you. So that's also a good prayer to start praying. But okay,
Are
let's.
there a lot of parents that watch the show?
Yes.
Well,
Yes.
then,
Yes.
while you're hiding your kids, you also can do a lot of prevention to make them more resilient and resistant to any kind of exploitation.
Yes.
And there's quite a bit of information in the book on prevention. And I liken it to teaching your children to brush their teeth. If you don't want your kids to have cavities, you teach them to brush their teeth. They don't even need to know what the word plaque means. They just need to know how to brush their teeth.
Love that.
And when you take them to the store, whatever, you hold onto their hand and you don't let them cross a street until you've taught them, look both ways. Well, now the internet is the highway, and parents aren't teaching their children how to be safe on the internet. And we know the perpetrators are out there.
Yes.
We know that if they step out into that lane, a car is going to hit them. So parents, do practice with your kids internet safety. There's lots of resources in the book. Netsmarts.org is my favorite free resource, and it has resources in English and in Spanish. It's available to everybody. And it's got material for a 3-year-old up to a high school student. But it isn't something you do once a year. It's not like getting your mumps and measles vaccine. It's like brushing your teeth. You have to do it every single day, just like you taught your kids how to cross the street. How old were you when you first crossed the street by yourself?
Oh, probably 5 or 6.
Yeah, and there was a lot of practice runs, and Mom stood there and watched you the first time, and still said as you left the door, "Be careful, be careful." And so there's lots of ways parents can make sure their children are safe, because internet predators, whether it's for human trafficking or anything, have increased substantially, and 80% of recruiting here in California, our victims were recruited on the internet.
My goodness. Okay, you heard it. I mean, that is such wisdom. We need to be in communication with our kids. I mean, many times parents are working, so they just give them the computer with no guidelines and with no oversight.
Okay, so I don't want to scare people or anything,
No.
but it's not just a computer, internet games, an Xbox.
Okay.
I talked to one mom, and she's like, she wanted to fix dinner, so she set up the Xbox, and her 4-year-old was playing a game, and then she heard a different voice.
Wow.
And she's like, what's going on? A man was talking to her 4-year-old son. He'd made contact through that internet. Now, doesn't mean you have to throw out all your games.
No.
You just need to be knowledge and insight and have discernment. How to set the privacy settings on games you let your children play. How to make sure that you're in the room and they're not by themselves. All of those kinds of parental and grandparent guidelines. I love talking to grandparents because grandparents have a lot of influence with the parents. Because they're going to call and say, so do you know about this NetSmarts thing? I think you should. And what's happening in your schools? Are they doing cyber safety? Most schools are, and you can be practicing the same things at home so your kids are safe when you're not around.
So when they do contact a child on our social media, how do they actually meet them?
Well, they usually pretend to be a friend. Oh, I'm playing this game too.
Okay.
Or they're on Facebook, and they're, or no, they're not on Facebook. We're on Facebook. These kids are on Instagram or something else, Snapchat, and who knows. But it's the principle that matters. They present as a similar age
Okay.
because you can put any picture up.
Yeah.
You don't have to use your real picture. And you can do your about information and say you're 16 years old and you're this cute new high school junior and you want to meet the girls over summer.
Okay. Okay.
And then start asking questions. Can we meet at the mall? Or can you send me a picture of you
my
in a
goodness.
bikini?
My goodness.
And so, you know, your kids don't have to be ignorant. You can teach them to understand who really is a friend. Just because someone likes what you have on the internet doesn't mean they're your friend. And their brains aren't done yet, so they don't have good risk management skills. So it is a parent's responsibility
Goodness.
to do the prevention work, to make sure if you didn't teach your kids to brush their teeth and child welfare got called when they started first grade because your child showed up with rotten teeth,
Right.
they would come do a home visit for neglect.
My goodness.
And it is
Indeed.
exactly
Yeah.
the same parallel.
Okay.
So parents, you need to learn how to teach your kids to be safe. And it doesn't mean they can never cross the street. Because the internet is full of knowledge. And I love the Instagram of stunning oceans. I love to watch the whales and the dolphins. So I don't want to give that up, but I want to be smart. Somebody that wants to be my friend and I don't know them, I'm not going to click yes. They're not my friend.
Boy, this really is something that the church needs, definitely. We need to bring this into our churches. We need to bring her. Now, how would they get in touch with you if they would like you to come and speak?
Oh, you can email the Global Center for Women and Justice. The email address is GCWJ, Global Center for Women and Justice, GCWJ at vanguard.edu. And if you would like to listen to me a lot, I have 280 episodes of the Ending Human Trafficking podcast. And you can find that wherever you listen to podcasts, Apple, Spotify,
Okay. iTunes.
Stitcher, all of that. Or
Okay.
you can go to the webpage.
Okay. Oh, now I want to address this before we only have 3 minutes left, but I do want to address this. It says with people that are in power, prosecution, people in power, places of power. Can you talk about that?
That's why I want the church to be educated so you can show up in the marketplace and be a voice for those who won't be able to show up there. Advocate for laws to be passed. Advocate for supply chain transparency in companies. If you're buying t-shirts 3 for $10, I'm just going to tell you, no one can ethically pay everybody in that process to get it to market a fair wage for $3.33 each.
Okay.
So I'm not going to drive demand for cheap products, and I can hold those corporations responsible. I can call them, I can
That's
email
good.
and say, how are you doing with supply chain transparency at your company?
Because that's another
And you can ask
red
your
flag.
church, is your coffee slave-free?
Say that again.
You can ask at your church, is our coffee slave-free?
My goodness.
Now, not every church checks, and then sometimes they do, and then they slide off because somebody else comes in and starts purchasing. So, yeah, checking those things.
Goodness,
We've
who
come a
thought of
long way.
that?
Um, Almost all of our major coffee companies in the U.S. now check their supply chains
Do
really
they?
well.
My goodness. And that would go back to what country?
Well, they would be checking wherever the beans come from, Guatemala, Africa, Egypt, yeah, South America.
So, okay, so we have a little bit of time left. I want you to look into that camera and whatever it's on your heart to say, please do.
I want people who want to share the love of God with the most marginalized to read Philippians 1:9-11. And if you want your love to abound, then be intentional about getting the knowledge and insight so that you can build discernment in your church, so that when your church steps into the marketplace, just like Paul, you know the language, you understand the vocabulary, and you can be a respected member of the community that brings honor to God's house.
And always remember to speak to your children, speak value to them, speak identity to them, speak how wonderfully, fearfully and wonderfully they're made. Because when we have a strong identity, then that is going to prevent a lot of our children to be a victim. Okay, so speak well of your children, speak to your children daily. Don't neglect them. Don't neglect them. Pray with them. Make time for them. Children are our legacy. So thank you so much for being with us. And Doctor, thank
Thank
you for being
you.
with us.